Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Joe Schmitt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. Today, this Maine Department of Education virtual professional development opportunity is being led by Adam Schmitt, professor at the University of Southern Maine. This is a result of the Maine Council for Social Studies board members putting together a survey and looking at potential offerings that they could host. Myself and Adam were two of the people who expressed interest in that, and in the end kind of thought that instead of reinventing the wheel, continuing to work through the work that I've been doing. So I do want to give a little bit of initial recognition to the Maine Council for Social Studies in their work and helping provide and connect us with Adam Schmitt. Not that I didn't know Adam before. We're trying to get him to spell his last name correctly, but so far he's going to go with the 2T approach. So without any further ado, Adam Schmitt from USM, he's going to have the floor and he's going to talk about asynchronous learning with you guys today.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to show up today. It's wonderful to see you all and to be able to have a nice professional conversation. I will say that I am currently, doing like stay home and like shelter in place with 3 young children. So I'm hoping that none of them join us during our talk today, but you might see a little head come bob around. I think I locked the door though, so we should be safe. So as Joe said, my name's Adam Schmitt, and I am a social studies education professor at University of Southern Maine. And prior to coming to Maine, and why I feel, I suppose, like I can talk about asynchronous discussions, I was a middle school social studies teacher for 10 years in Central Illinois. So as I talk, you'll probably notice that I have a light Chicago accent present in my voice. And so I taught middle school for 10 years in Central Illinois. And then when I was doing my PhD, I taught social studies education courses at Michigan State, where I taught as part of the online master's program there. So I have quite a bit of experience teaching online. And what's interesting is most of my experience teaching online is with college students, and all of the issues that I'll be talking about today are issues that are very much true for high school students and middle school students, also very true for college students. So the issues of how to meaningfully facilitate a online discussion that's not happening in real time is just kind of a consistent across the board, regardless of what population you're working with. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If you have questions at any time, and I'll be soliciting some questions in a moment, but if you have questions at any time, please feel free to chime in. My approach to teaching is I want us to be able to surface what our concerns are and what any obstacles that we think that we might be facing with developing our ability to facilitate these conversations, what those obstacles are, because if we talk about them, then we can hopefully address them. And also that I'm not like the sole authority on this, but we can also use some groupthink as well to come up with any solutions that we need to come up with. So let me share my screen here, and we will get started. All right, so I'll put my email address up at the end as well, but my email is adam.schmitt@maine.edu. If you want to talk more about this or literally anything social studies related, I'm happy to be a resource for folks. So please feel free to reach out. Okay, so first of all, what do I mean when I say asynchronous discussion? It's always good to define our terms. So asynchronous discussion is discussion that does not take place in real time, such as through the use of discussion boards. So whether it's on Google Classroom or through some other sort of like Moodle or some other sort of learning platform. Just a discussion where we throw out the question and it's out there in the ether to be taken up at some point by our students. So the problem, and this is a problem that according to a social studies guy named Wayne Journell, and in 2008, he wrote an article about kind of what are the issues with facilitating asynchronous discussion. So I will say that some of how I frame this comes from his work, but really this is very rooted in my experiences doing online teaching over the past 8 years or so. But the problem, according to Journal, is that kind of writ large in education, we ascribe to social constructivist theories of learning. And those theories argue that learning happens through social interaction, that through talking to people, we make sense of the world, we make connections to things that perhaps we hadn't made sense of before. But it's through that process of social interaction by which we learn. So the question then is, how do we facilitate interaction in an online environment when students aren't responding in real time, and when students have the, in an in-person scenario, we can always look at a student who may not be participating and we can say, hey, let's invite you into this conversation. Or we can engage with a student who may say something that is a complete misconception of the issue that's going on. And we can say, okay, let's clarify that misconception, or maybe think about this kind of alternative viewpoint. That becomes much harder in an online environment because, of course, it's highly dependent upon whether or not students want to do anything. Like you can put out there and say, hey, you have this misconception, but there's not necessarily a reason for them to engage if they don't feel like engaging. So basically, how do we facilitate interaction, and how do we get the level of discussion, the level of discourse that we want to see happen? So what I'd like us to do now is just take a moment to reflect on our own practices and experiences. And if people would be willing, either through the chat function or just by unmuting and talking, answer one of these 3 questions. What have been your experiences with asynchronous discussion? What successes have you experienced with it, or what obstacles do you see to being successful? And when thinking about experiences, whether they're successful or they're obstacles, think about both your experiences as a teacher, and you can also think about your experiences as a student who may have taken part in asynchronous discussions. So please feel free to continue to put things in the chat, but just to run down what some folks have already said. So some of you have had experiences being grad students doing online coursework, which then one of my follow-up questions to those of you who have had the experience of being an online student doing kind of asynchronous discussions, did you enjoy that process? Or what worked for you and what didn't work for you? The issues of how students engage, such as if there's profanity, students feeling like they just want to get the task done and leave, they don't want to engage at all, not getting an immediate response to an idea, so then maybe not being able to develop an idea further, just kind of dropping it and moving on. Feeling that it feels canned. Students copying work, yeah. All right, so the good news is, based on what folks have written, there are things that we can do to help mediate some some of these issues. And yeah, so here's some, whoops. Here's some that I put up, or that you see as common obstacles in literature. So if we're thinking about our job as social studies teachers is to engage students in, actually engaging in historical thinking or geographic thinking or fill in the blank thinking. One of the issues with online learning is students retreat into relying on personal experiences, and there's a lack of substance. So it oftentimes becomes about like, well, I feel that I didn't like this or I didn't like that. And it's not really necessarily picking apart what's the historical issue that's being presented here, what kinds of skills can we apply to thinking through this historical event for thinking about history. Another issue is, and this really goes with the comment of students just kind of wanting to get in and get it done, is surface level responses to peers and the lack of continuing engagement. That when we require students to respond to somebody, they will just kind of do like, oh yeah, I agree, or that was a great point. And they don't necessarily follow up. There's very little desire to challenge one another. I think part of this comes from both just wanting to get the task done and be like, okay, I've crossed that off my list. I think that it also comes from a place of students don't necessarily know how to disagree with one another. And in an online format, when you're relying on writing, issues of tone can always be lost in the translation of reading. So there's a concern that if I try to engage with this person's idea and push back on their thinking, then I will be seen as being rude or mean or whatever. And then finally, there are wildly different levels. Yes, as Jen just said, people as a whole don't like confrontation, and that is 100% true. So really, I think part of it is how do we work with our students in realizing that it's about discussing ideas and it's to further develop one's thinking, and it's not necessarily about confrontation because it feels so confrontational. And then there are also real different levels of student participation. And this can be that you have some students who participate a lot. It can be that you have some students who don't participate very much. It can be that there are students who have really high quality substantive posts that kind of guide discussion, and then everybody else just kind of follows along. So there are a lot of different ways in which, or if it's over the course of a week, you might have like group A of students who are active in the first half of the week and group B who kind of straggle in at the end, and you end up having two very different conversations. Okay. So what I want to do now, and please throw out any questions that you have as we go through this, but what I'd like to start with is just what are some kind of tips for structuring discussion? What does good practice around asynchronous discussions look like? So first of all, one of the issues that happens in online asynchronous discussions is that people just kind of will throw out like, you need to create a discussion post. And they don't necessarily give much guidance for what that post should look like. So there's a need to create prompts. And some of the best questions that we can use are questions that require students to apply material as opposed to restate it. One of the things that I always say to my students is I typically only ask questions, and this was true when I taught middle school, and it's true of my work at the university level. I typically only try to ask questions that I'm interested in knowing the answer to. What are questions that I'm interested in hearing somebody else's opinion on? And there's always a tension. that we have learning goals that we need our students to meet. We have assessments that we need them to perform well on. But how can we create prompts and pose questions that require students to demonstrate their knowledge through thinking about something else? So it could be like, well, to use an example from my own personal experience this semester. So I'm teaching a class on the history of American education. And one of the questions I asked students was, suppose, choose a historical figure in the history of American education like Horace Mann or John Dewey. Suppose they came and visited a school today. What would be the things that they would like? What would be the things that they wouldn't like? A prompt like that makes students apply what it is that they're contending with. So in order to talk about what John Dewey would like or not like about schools today, you have to understand what John Dewey's philosophy is. It also allows for there to not be, if you're a high school teacher and you have 100 students a day, it also allows for you to not have to read the same response 100 times, because there's more of the student is written into the response that they have. At the most positive level, obviously, there are going to be students who don't totally engage with it. But posing a question that applies material. So if students are learning about a historical decision, evaluating that decision, and then using proof, like what argument did you read that you thought was the most compelling argument? What did you think was the weakest argument? And going from there. Secondly, this is something that Journal found in his 2008 study, and I have the citation for it at the end of this for anybody who wants to read it. And if you have problems accessing it, you can always reach out, and I'm happy to send it to you. But providing sources to aid in answering the prompts. Journal found in his study was very small, but he found in his study that students tended to do better when they had the availability of primary sources to answer the questions that they were supposed to engage with on the discussion board. So by giving students a question where they have to apply their knowledge and then giving them sources that they can work with allows for a more kind of authentic engagement with what the issue is. And he was specifically looking at, this is back in 2008, and he was looking at high school classrooms, I believe in the state of Michigan, that were fully online high school courses. Michigan has Michigan Virtual High School, where some students just attend high school virtually. Some students might take one or two classes that maybe not offered at their school. They take it virtually. So it was like a full semester course. So providing sources to aid in answering prompts. So I think this one's a really important one. Setting a fixed timeline for participation. The more structure you can give an asynchronous discussion, typically the better it is. So if you have, that helps deal with several problems. One of the things that I noticed when I taught online, and I alluded to it a moment ago, is that I would get kind of two different groups of students. I would have a group of students who was very gung-ho, they did everything right away. And if I had things stretched out on a Monday to Friday timeline, the students on this early group of students, they would post all their stuff on Monday, maybe Tuesday, but they were kind of the Monday, Tuesday group. And then I had the Thursday, really more late Friday group. And these two groups never really spoke to one another. So this is an issue because, of course, one of the things that we want to do when we have a class of students is we want to expose people to a variety of different voices and opinions, and not just kind of the same echo chamber that they might be used to operating within. So by setting a timeline for participation, what you do is you set the parameters for when this discussion is going to take place. So it might be that on Monday, let's say it's a Monday to Friday, that everybody has to do their initial post by Wednesday. And then they cannot respond until Thursday and Friday. So everybody has to do their initial posts in the first half of the week, and then they can follow up and do the responses to other people in the second half of the week. By giving these specific due dates and by putting a limit on how participation looks, you can help kind of equalize the equalize the kinds of conversations that students have with one another and who they talk to. The other thing that's really important is one of the things that oftentimes gets left out of conversations about online teaching, which I'm sure everybody is coping with right now, is that the sheer amount of work that goes into online teaching is not necessarily more than in-person teaching, but it's really different. And when you're facilitating an online discussion, it's a much different beast to be in a classroom and listen to what students are saying to one another and respond to what students are saying to each other in real time than it is to read all of these thoughts that students have. So I've also found that by setting a fixed timeline for participation, I actually really get much more time for me to actually go in and read what students are writing. And I don't always hold myself accountable for reading every single response that students give to one another, but I do read their initial posts with a real fine-tooth comb, and then I'll talk about what I do with that momentarily, but I then kind of keep track of their responses more informally. And that's just because if I'm looking at, 100 posts a week, that's a lot to do and to do something meaningful with. Building off of what I just said a moment ago, creating and rotating smaller discussion groups is also really important. So if you have a class of 25 students, let's say, it's a really daunting task if you say, okay, you have to create your initial post by Wednesday, and you have to do your responses to your classmates by Friday. And in doing your responses to your classmates, pick 2 people to respond to. And typically what will happen is if you're a student, you'll do one of 2 things. You'll say, oh man, I got to try to read these 24 other responses that people have written. Or you'll say, I'm just going to respond to the first 2 people I look at. And you end up with there being really limited engagement with one another. So what I do is for each week, I have smaller discussion groups that I set up that are typically around 4 to 5 students in a group. So that way, and I always have it, when I do discussion this way, I always have it, you do your initial post and you have to respond to 2 other people. So when they are in a group of 4, they still have choice. I think choice is really important in education and in learning. So they still have a choice. They don't have to respond to all 3 people. They can choose the 2 people who they want to respond to. It also gives a buffer if you have a student who doesn't post a week, that there's still a little buffer there. But they still have a choice of, okay, who are the 2 people that I want to respond to? And by choosing 2 people to respond to out of 3, it's a much less daunting task than choosing 2 people out of 25, where there may be a feeling that they have to read everybody's stuff. And then I rotate those groups. So sometimes I'll have groups last for, like if I teach a whole semester online, I'll do like modules or units. So groups might stay together for each module and then change between modules. If it's like my current class that I'm teaching where it was an in-person class that got switched to being online due to COVID-19, I've been switching up the groups every week. And it's just so that students, and you know, there are multiple ways that you can think about it. It might be good to leave students in groups for an entire semester or for a longer chunk of time so they get comfortable with each other, build that community, build that rapport. But I like to mix it up at least every so often so that students are seeing a range of perspectives. And I try to be thoughtful about, okay, like who's making really high quality posts, who needs some more support, and kind of doing some heterogeneous grouping so that students can see just different ways that people are engaging. Then varying our pedagogical approach. So the other thing is always responding to a prompt and then responding to two peers can be really draining, and it can feel really inauthentic. And I found that by kind of mixing things up every so often, I don't know if it necessarily like makes the task any more enjoyable, but it is just a different way to engage. And it's just like, nobody likes walking into a classroom and doing the exact same thing every single day. It's the same thing with online. And I found success creating collaborative charts or coming up with other group tasks. So we could do like a collaborative chart on, let's say, the causes of the American Revolution. And students have to each make a contribution to the chart. So one contribution to the chart can be they have to describe what one of the acts was. So what's the Quartering Act, or what are the Intolerable Acts, or what's the Stamp Act? Somebody else might have to contribute by putting in what was the cause of that act. Somebody else could put in what was the effect of that act. But coming up with some sort of chart, more or less doing an online jigsaw. So just like we would do a jigsaw in class, how can we do a jigsaw online where students can take information, they can choose where they want to plug in, they can put their initials in there so you know where they took part. And then how are they building something something together, where it's not necessarily always, this is my stance on this and let me evaluate other people, but it's just how can we kind of bring collectively what we've read together to create a bigger understanding. And then the important part is doing something with that, following up. So I'll talk about that in just a moment. Any questions at this point? So this is about just kind of like how to structure it. We're going to talk into some of the kind of teacher moves next. And I will say, it's also really good to clearly outline, I can't remember if I have this at the very end, it might be on the next slide, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself in just a moment here. But it's really good to have things like word limits. How do you set how long a post should be? How do you clearly communicate what your expectations for what a post should look like to students? So having things like word limits, and I think word limits, sometimes it's good to have them be longer, like you should write at least, 200 words. But I think also sometimes it can be really good to have them be short. Like just give me a quick, 50 words, 60 words on this, and really having to have students think succinctly and understand that a good post isn't necessarily about writing a lot. It's focusing on what's important. And so Alexa asked if I'm going to talk about assessment. And I can happily talk about assessment. And then there's also a question, do I ever scaffold the process or provide models of engaged responses? And the answer to that is yes, and I will talk about that in just a moment. And then Cindy just mentioned that she's experienced both the kind of tighter time frame and the longer groups, and that the doing it in a specific time frame was better, also because the teacher participated during that time frame, so it felt more like a real conversation. All right, so thinking about the teacher's role. Hey, look at that. So having clear expectations in each discussion board. So this is one of those things where it's like, do it everywhere. I'm always somewhat amazed by how you can put things in like 6 different places and still get questions about like, hey, I don't know what to do. It's like, oh, it was in an email, on the course site, in the syllabus. You know, we talked on the phone last night about it, whatever. But having really clear expectations in each discussion board, providing information about word limits, whether or not you want them to include quotes, expectations about responses, and any other parameters that you have. The clearer you can be about what you want students to do, the better they generally do. Yes, I think it's good to model and to provide students with examples of what strong posts and responses look like. Really laying out, if this is what a post, this is what it should look like. And here's how it specifically meets the guidelines that I've set out. I think the more that you can do with front loading this type of information at the beginning of whenever you start something like this, the better. This can also be something that, you know, whenever we return to teaching in person and in real time, that whenever we return to that, sometimes it's good to have an asynchronous online discussion board that's going as part of your class, and then you can actually check in, you know, each week to talk about, okay, so we have this discussion board this week. What went well about last week's discussion board? What was a post that we think went really well or looked really good? And how can we talk about what that post looks like? So really modeling and providing students, and I think through providing prompts to have students respond to. I always leave it up to students, and of course I have the luxury of working with college students at this point. But even when I taught middle school, leaving it up to students to some degree of like, here are some prompts. If you need a prompt, here's a prompt that you can respond to. If you want to write about something else, feel free to write about something else. It just needs to fit these guidelines of how I would like you to participate in this discussion this week. Providing individual and whole class feedback. I think this is the most important part. For those of you who have had online courses before and been students in online courses, there's oftentimes a feeling that the work that you do just gets thrown out there and nobody actually reads it. Nobody does anything with it. It's just, I created this work, nobody's coming back to it, it's just there. So providing individual and whole class feedback, I think is really important. So individual feedback, I don't think needs to be on like a weekly basis, but at least through whatever time period you're doing an online portion of class, following up with students by emailing them or by communicating with them otherwise, just, hey, how are you doing? Or taking a specific post and grading it like you would a paper. For me, assessment in this isn't necessarily, well, for me, my assessment philosophy is oftentimes either you did it or you didn't do it. And then if you did it, here's feedback on how you did it in order to help develop your skills to do it better next time. There, of course, can be points that are assigned to, did you bring in a quote? Did you meet the word limit? Did you substantively engage with the topic? Did you support your opinions with evidence from the text? There are definitely ways in which we can work out a grading schematic for looking at posts. I personally feel like it's more helpful if it's on the level of feedback, and then following up with students if they followed that feedback or not. But providing some sort of individual feedback to students where you can say, hey, I see you, I see your work. This is what I think of your work in terms of what my guidelines are. Here's how you can better meet those guidelines. Almost more importantly, I think, is giving whole class feedback. I really love creating, I call them podcasts, but they're really just kind of summative lectures where, again, I read through everybody's initial post really closely and I pull out, what are people talking about? What are kind of the big themes that have come up? What are the major misconceptions that have come up? What are the things that are really grabbing students' attention that are good, and what's kind of missing? What are they missing out on that I want them to think about more? So providing individual and whole class feedback, what it does is it allows students to be seen, for them to know that their work isn't just being cast out there into the world and nobody's looking at it, that you're not only looking at it, but you're thinking about it and you're using it to help their peers think about stuff as well. I oftentimes like to name check students in these podcasts where I say, this person brought up this, and this is how this person responded, or it made me connect, this person who's in group 1 who maybe didn't see what was in, a member in group 2's post. This helps me, like, this is a connection between these two people, but really leveraging the work that students do to help them think about the next step. If they do a collaborative chart, revisiting that chart, talking about, okay, what are the things that we got on this chart? What are some of the things that are missing? And then how can we use this chart to build into doing something in the next week? But I think it makes a really big difference to students. It's something that I've gotten a lot of positive feedback on. One of my classes that I teach at USM is every other week in person and online. And I try to do podcasts that bridge those weeks. So like, hey, last week we were in person, this is what we talked about. This is how it connects to what we're doing online this week. Or when I teach fully online, it helps students know that their work is being read and thought about. And I've actually gotten feedback from students that they used to like tell their parents or call their mom whenever I would reference them in the summative podcasts, because they're like, oh, they're like, somebody cared what I had to say. So having some sort of feedback to let students know that what they're contributing is actually valued and is actually being thought about and is actually serving the larger purpose of the class is really important. And whoops. Also providing an opportunity for a synchronous check-in. If this is like a longer time thing, providing opportunity for a synchronous check-in during the course of the class. So you might have, I oftentimes do, like, if this is an entirely online class, or let's say you're online for like a month or two, setting up a time, whether it's as a whole group or in small groups, to log on to an application like Zoom or Google Hangouts, and to actually like check in with students and say, okay, how's it going? Or let's have a conversation about what's been going on in the online discussion. What's been going well for you? What hasn't been going well for you? What's been one of your big takeaways from the class so far? What's something that you're still wondering about? But having a moment to do either individual or small group check-ins to just kind of see how it's going, and for them to see that you're there, especially if it's like a fully online class. being able to put names to faces and things like that are really important. But basically, there are concerns about what if students are using profanity? What if students aren't engaging? Just like in-person discussion, it's all about setting expectations, setting norms, and holding students accountable to those norms, and that there are consequences to violating those classroom norms. Because you wouldn't be like swearing in class, hopefully, and you shouldn't be, or you wouldn't be personally attacking somebody, and you shouldn't be doing those things online either. So at this point, any questions, concerns that people still have? One question that I think is always an interesting one is, should teachers contribute to online discussions? Or should they just kind of stay out of it and read them and evaluate them in ways that I'm talking about from kind of a distance, or should they jump in and directly respond? So I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that, or what other questions or comments, concerns do people have? So feel free to either unmute or type in the chat box.
I'm just going to talk instead of typing. I think with online discussions, it's always helpful for a teacher to give their feedback or talk, because in a real classroom, a teacher doesn't just not participate in the conversation. They engage with the students and they ask more questions, or they give more information. So I had put in the chat box earlier that some of the best online classes I had taken, a professor would interact with us and keep the conversation going and add more thoughts, or ask questions to keep it going, because there are times where it just gets stagnant. But it's just like a classroom where you have to have that. That's what our job is to contribute to the classroom discussion to keep it going, I guess.
Great, thank you. And Susan agrees. She says that teachers should contribute to online discussions so students stay more engaged. Anyone else?
I would agree with Jen to just further that, further what she said, is my online courses with my professors, or when we're, sometimes I'm dialoguing with a student that I work with. I work in a self-contained classroom, and sometimes when he's in his gen ed classroom, I'm actually dialoguing with him down in self-contained. So it helps when that teacher is having input, because they continue the thread, they make the connections that sometimes the students can't by themselves. And like Jen said, it gets stagnant, it just gets stuck there. Everybody feels like, oh, I've done enough work, what do I do now? And the teacher is the facilitator, if you will.
Great, thank you, Gina. And Lex says that it's a good idea. It reminds middle schoolers that you're paying attention to the content, which I think especially as you get younger, it's really good to, hey, I'm here. I'm reading what you're throwing out there in the world. So be aware of that. And having taught 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, they are a squirrely bunch. So it is really good to show that you're there. I personally have mixed feelings about it. I sometimes jump in. I especially jump in if I think something's problematic, or I think something's really being not thought about. Like there's a big point being missed. I think that one of the big tenets of social constructivism, and the idea that we learn through interacting, is that it displaces the authority from being like fully vested in the teacher to being a little more spread out. So I liked what I believe it was Gina said about being more of a facilitator. How do we facilitate? And we can think about just structuring asynchronous online discussions in this way. Like, how do we facilitate a a forum for students to think and engage with one another. And what does facilitation look like? Sometimes facilitation looks like really jumping in and being present and raising questions. I sometimes find, and this just might be more of a college student thing, that I'll throw something in and then it's like nobody ever circles back around to it. So sometimes it's like, okay, well, do we put in an expectation that if somebody asks you a question that you respond to the question in order to make sure that people are actually engaging with what the ideas are. And sometimes I just kind of want to let it go and let them just kind of talk to one another and let them grapple through it, because I oftentimes find, and this is true when I taught middle school as well, I oftentimes find if I have the desire to jump in and say something and be like, what about this? If I usually just wait like a minute or two more, a kid actually says it. And then it can oftentimes be more powerful. It comes from a student. So I kind of do this, and like, this probably isn't like a good, like, this isn't a piece of advice. This is probably problematic on my end. I kind of try to do both, where sometimes I hang back, but if I really think that there's something being missed, I do jump in order to try to help right the ship. Because to speak to that earlier point about the lack of substantive engagement, really in-person conversations, teachers oftentimes play the role of devil's advocate, where they're like, but did you think about this point? Whereas in online discussions, it becomes more about helping guide students back to the key points that you're trying to help them understand. Because it's so easy for them to disengage from those key points and to just start talking about their opinions and to talk, and which I love when kids talk about their opinions. But if we're trying to teach them specific objectives, getting them to use evidence to back up their claims, as opposed to just being like, well, I thought this was good, or I thought this was bad, and kind of talking about it in really generic kind of surface level ways, the teacher contributing to those online discussions can be a way to facilitate digging deeper with them. Say, well, you said this, but what proof do you see for that viewpoint? How can you back that up through using the textbook or whatever sources we used that are going along with this topic that we're talking about? Any other questions or concerns? I know our time is winding down here, but I want to give people a chance to chime in if they'd like.
Does anybody have any questions for Adam?
Thank you, Joe. Adam, where in Central Illinois did you teach?
Champaign-Urbana,
Okay.
where University of Illinois is.
Yeah, I'm a Saluki.
Oh, nice.
And my
Carbondale.
Yes, my parents were both from Effingham.
Oh, nice. All right.
Yeah.
Right there on I-70.
Crossroads of America.
Yes. All right. Well, I will leave you all with just kind of the big takeaways, I guess, to just kind of summarize, is Parker and Hess, and if you've never read anything by Diana Hess, she's an awesome source for issues related to discussion in the classrooms. But Diana Hess and Walter Parker wrote an article back in 2001, and one of the things that they talk about is that as social studies teachers, we need to teach for discussion, not just with discussion. So that if we're going to use discussion, discussion is not just a means of engaging with social studies concepts. We also need to teach students how to discuss, and that's a process. And many of us, I'm sure, I had the luxury so I taught for 5 years in a large public middle school, and I taught for 5 years in a smaller private one. And when I taught in the private school, I taught 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. I primarily taught 6th grade at the public one, but I had kids for multiple years in a row at the private school. And it was interesting because in 6th grade, they weren't very good at discussing when they came in, not surprisingly. But their skills got much better over time because we kept chipping away at it. So if we want students to be successful in discussion, whether it's in person or whether it's online, we really have to actively teach them how to discuss through modeling, through setting norms, through giving feedback. And building on that, many techniques for online discussion are the same as in-person discussion. So thinking about how to structure it, how to assess it, many of those are the same kinds of ways that we need to think about how we would think about it in class is what we need to think about in terms of if it's happening online. And then finally, clear communication and structure are key. Really being open with students, communicating often, showing them that we're thinking about what they're writing, and giving them structure to support them is going to be kind of the way to help them be successful in the long run. So for more information, like I said, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to send you this article, but Wayne Journell wrote this article, Facilitating Historical Discussions Using Asynchronous Communication, the Role of the Teacher, back in 2008, which, I mean, the ways in which technology has changed in the past 12 years, I would hope that somebody would do an updated version of this at some point. Although, like I said, most of my presentation jives really well with the things that he says. So in many ways, not much has changed. And then, as I also said, feel free to reach out to me at any time. But thank you very much for listening to me. I hope this was helpful, and happy to help people think about anything related to social studies that you might need, and obviously happy to learn from you all as well. So hope you have a good rest of your week, and thank you for taking the time.
I have put the link in the chat box for your feedback and contact hour certificate. While we still have Adam with us, is there anybody who has any last second questions before I turn off the recording? Jen, was that a hand? Oh, no, that was her waving. Okay, I thought I saw a hand. Okay, any last second questions for Adam? And Adam, are you willing to share your presentation so I can put it on the website right with the webinar?
Yeah, happily.
And then do you think we'd be able to post that article from Journal?
Sure, I'll send it.
Okay.
It's from Theory and Research in Social Education, and I'm sure it's not a problem. So okay. I'll send it along.
We can post that in as well. Last call, and any questions to be recorded?